The whole Atlantis issue, again, I've taken a look at the kind of attacks that have taken place around my references to Atlantis. And those attacks, they always seek to isolate Atlantis and make us think that that's just the only story that there is about a lost civilization of prehistory. Whereas, in fact, ancient cultures all around the world preserved a memory of a high civilization of prehistory. In India, it was called Kumari Kandam. But if you go to Mesopotamia, you're going to find the same story of a great flood and survivors of a flood who taught knowledge around the world. You're going to find the same story in ancient Egypt. You're going to find the same story everywhere. As a matter of fact, the Atlantis story is present in ancient Egypt. They just don't call it Atlantis. They use a different word for it in the ancient Egyptian language. Atlantis is not an ancient Egyptian word. But that's not surprising if we consider the pedigree of the Atlantis story. The Atlantis story, as it's come down to us, the earliest surviving reference to it is in the works of Plato, who is a revered figure in his own right, the Greek philosopher Plato, and in his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. And Plato draws his information from an individual who may well have been an ancestor of his, Solon, the great Greek lawmaker. Solon was famous for his codification of laws in Greece, and he was a traveler, and he made a well-documented visit to Egypt around about the year in our calendar 600 BC. And in that visit to Egypt, as Plato reports the story as he had received it, as he reports it in these dialogues, where he puts the words into the mouths of two people who are talking, Solon was told by the priests of the Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta, a temple that no longer exists. He pointed to writings on the walls, and there was a priest who spoke Greek and ancient Egyptian, and he asked that priest to tell him, what do these writings say? And the priest then repeated the story of Atlantis, and Plato put that into the Greek language as Atlantis. We don't know what the ancient Egyptians called it there, but I do know that they called it the homeland of the primeval ones from another temple. Solon then asks the priests, so this Atlantis was destroyed in an enormous flood. When did that happen? And they said quite matter-of-factly, 9,000 years ago. So there you need to do the math. This is 600 BC that Solon is receiving that information that he transmits to Plato. 9,000 years before 600 BC is 11,623 years ago, if you wish to be precise. Let's say roughly 11,600 years ago. And this is one of the reasons why I take Plato's report seriously, because 11,600 years ago was one of those massive pulses of meltwater that coincided with the ending of the last ice age, just as the Younger Dryas began 12,800 years ago with an anomalous sea level rise, thoroughly documented in the work of Cesare Emiliani. Just as it began with a sea level rise, it also ended 11,600 years ago with a massive sea level rise, which is called Meltwater Pulse 1b. And when archaeologists try to get rid of this, they say, well, look, Meltwater Pulse 1b unfolded over a period of 600 years. So in any 1 year, if you do the average, it wasn't that much. But that's not how the meltwater pulse worked. There were years of massive rises in sea level. And again, this is documented in the death of corals. And there were years when not much happened. So averaging it out over 600 years is not the way to do it. We have a time in relatively recent history, prehistory, 11,600 years ago, when there was an enormous global flood. And is it a coincidence that Plato names precisely that time for the submergence of Atlantis? I don't think so. I don't think it's a coincidence at all. I think it's another reason why we should have respect for Plato, have respect to the tradition that was passed down to him through the line of Solon, and have respect for Meltwater Pulse 1b and its complexities over a period of about 600 years. And finally, of course, there's the fact that Göbekli Tepe, this extraordinary megalithic site in Turkey, as far as we can tell now, the work began on that site, guess when? 11,600 years ago. I can't help feeling that we're looking at a project that was initiated by survivors of that cataclysm to bring to that place skills and knowledge that had not previously existed in that place, to create a gigantic megalithic site, indeed partly for spiritual reasons, but also partly to mobilize a local population, to give them a big project to work on and during that project to teach them agriculture. At the beginning, Göbekli Tepe was entirely inhabited by hunter-gatherers. 1,000 years later, they were all agriculturalists, and during those 1,000 years, the whole Göbekli Tepe was created, and then, lo and behold, once that was achieved, it was buried, deliberately buried. More work was put into burying it than was put into creating it. These stone circles were filled up with piles of rubble, and then they created a rubble hill over the top of the whole thing. And that's why Göbekli Tepe is such an important site, because it then remained sealed. Nobody was trampling all over it. No later cultures were coming in and contaminating the carbon dating with introduced materials from a later time. It's a sealed site, and it's 11,600 years old. And that coincides with Meltwater Pulse 1b, and that coincides with the date that Plato gives for the submergence of Atlantis. We can either choose to just say all of this is coincidence. In my case, I think it's not coincidence, and I think it's really worth looking at the implications of all of this with an open mind to see where it leads. I'm saying that there was a culture that emerged out of shamanism that developed certain skills, that was able to explore the world, and almost certainly influenced other cultures around the world. I think the dating of quite a number of megalithic sites needs to be reconsidered in the light of Göbekli Tepe. The notion before Göbekli Tepe was that the oldest megalithic site on Earth was about 6,000 years old. Suddenly we have this 11,600 years old megalithic site, and clearly the people who made it knew what they were doing. You don't move around 20-ton megaliths and carve, beautiful imagery into them in high relief. You don't do that without having experienced what you're doing. And that background at the moment is very hard to explain. Some archaeologists say, it must have been the Natufian culture, which existed in that area for 1,000 or 2,000 years before that. But what we see from the Natufian culture is just no more dramatic than a sort of dry stone wall in Wales. Nothing big, nothing extraordinary like this. I am yet to see the evolutionary process that could have led to Göbekli Tepe, and if it's there, I think it's going to change our entire view of history. It's interesting that now we have Karahan Tepe, which we also filmed at in the series, and 10 other sites have now been found in that area, which all date back that horizon. Goodness knows what is going to come out of all of those excavations. I mean, first of all, Göbekli Tepe was discovered by accident. Back in the 1950s, a team of American archaeologists who were interested in Stone Age stuff from the Paleolithic, the Upper Paleolithic, found themselves at Göbekli Tepe. And then they saw the tip of a beautifully carved pillar sticking out of the side of the hill. And they said, nah, that's not Stone Age. That's way too good. That must be Byzantine. That must be from just 1,000 years ago or so. So it's not our stuff. We're not going to excavate it. And there it was left until Klaus Schmidt, a great man of the German Archaeological Institute, who I knew personally, and who kindly showed me around Göbekli Tepe in 2013 and spent a lot of time with me. That's the kind of archaeologist I enjoy meeting, who doesn't typecast me. He knew who I was. But he certainly did, because we'd been in correspondence before. But, they don't automatically shut me out, but they're willing to talk to me, and he was willing to talk to me. And it was he who took an interest in that curious pillar sticking out of the ground and decided, let's excavate here. And lo and behold, they discovered Göbekli Tepe. Now that Göbekli Tepe was discovered, then suddenly there's a reason to look more widely than Karahan Tepe. When I first went to Karahan Tepe, it was just like Göbekli Tepe had been before, just a few bits of pillar sticking out of the ground. Now it's an enormous excavated site. And as I say, at least 10 other sites in that area of the 12 tepes, as they call them, the 12 hills. Göbekli Tepe itself means pot-bellied hill in the Turkish language, and that's because that's what it looked like until it was excavated. That hill was entirely artificial, entirely man-made, designed to cover up this site. I can't help thinking time capsule, that there was an intention to preserve this. The problem with many archaeological sites is that they have been tramped over by so many different cultures over so many different periods of time that it's really hard to date them. Carbon dating only dates organic materials. It doesn't date stone. Those organic materials need to be in situ, in a position where they could only have been placed there at the time the megalith was put in place. And that is very rare to find. So there's a lot of speculation and guesswork goes into the dating of megalithic sites.